Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik with Figure It Out Productions. The following video is part of our Quick Shoot series.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and welcome to part 8 of my 4th video game generation retrospective. Part 1 was about the generation as a whole. Parts 2 through 7 have been on various consoles. In order, TurboGrafx-16, Sega Genesis aka Sega Mega Drive, Sega CD, Sega 32X, Super Nintendo, Neo Geo AES, and now the Philips CDI. Before we go into this console though, I want to quickly extend a thank you to a guy named Ronald who lives in Austria. And I hope you guys will thank him too, because everything you see here, with the exception of just one of these games, was gifted to me from him, and he did not have to do that. I did a video about that back in December of 2014, and I never even saw a CDI in the United States before. And he sent these across the pond for free, and now I get to do the video because of that. So thank you to Ronald for doing that. So the console itself. Now, this console is a console that's fascinating for a lot of reasons. I think the most obviously is because of the insane amount of controversy that seems to circle it. Yet, it itself is actually not interesting. It actually kind of reminds me of a tornado. Like, there's a lot of chaos that surrounded the story of the Philips CDI, but inside the middle, there's that, that dead zone where nothing is happening. That's actually the CDI. It's just sitting in there, surrounded by madness. So, first let's start by, and I'll talk about that in a bit, but first let's talk about the actual history of this console. See, this is a very, very misunderstood gaming platform. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you, like, guys, it had so many good games on it, you just don't know because you never played it. That would not be the truth. The truth is, it's a terrible game console. But it's not a bad platform. And that's an important distinction that people don't tend to make. Because you have to understand, this thing came out in 1991 as the first CD-based console ever. The only two things that came out before it were the TurboGrafx CD and the Sega CD, but those were add-ons. The CDI, when it was released, it came out, of course, by Philips, who at the time was one of the biggest technological conglomerates on the planet. And their goal wasn't to make a video game console. It was to make an all-in-one purpose living room device that could do multiple things that families would enjoy together. See, they touted it more as like, it plays music CDs, which I know means nothing to us in 2015, but in 91, holy shit, I can play music CDs on my TV? What? Like, that was nuts. It also had karaoke support, which doesn't mean much to us in the West, but it would have theoretically helped them in Japan, though ironically I don't think they ever actually launched it there. I've never found confirmation of that. It also would be able to play VCDs, which was a big one. You have to remember, again, 91, digital streaming, Blu-rays, DVDs, none of that shit existed. What you had was VHS, Laserdisc, and VCD. And Laserdisc wasn't really popular, and you couldn't really put VHS in a CD-based console, but you could put VCDs in there. So the idea was this thing will play your movies, it'll play your music, you can have some fun with karaoke, but on top of that, it'll also have a lot of educational things so that the parents feel more comfortable picking it up. So, little Billy can use it to play, learn how to spell and do math, that kind of shit. And at the bottom of that list, oh, by the way, it's also a video game machine. That way they could also, kind of appeal to kids and have kids kind of nag their parents, like, maybe you should get a CDI, then I could play The Flowers of Robert Mapplethorpe, That was one of the educational titles, but you know what I'm saying. Like, the idea was, it wasn't really touting itself as a video game platform, which is why it no doubt was a very bad video game console. But before we go into further analysis of the console itself, let's talk about what I think everybody wants to talk about, which is that storm that surrounds it, the thing we all kind of know it for. Now, that storm has, like I said, very little to do with Philips and their CDI itself, but somehow it got mixed into it, and let's just tell the whole story here. So, in 1988, Ken Kutaragi, who would be later famous for making the line of PlayStation hardware, as you guys I'm sure know, he bought a Famicom, the Nintendo Famicom, aka the NES as we know it in the West. And he got it and was really unimpressed with the audio quality of the device. So he decided, I could make a better chip than this. And he did. And he brought it to Sony, who said, hey, that's pretty neat. We'll take it to Nintendo and see if they're willing to upgrade their hardware. So they did that, and Nintendo was really impressed. And they said, this is awesome. Why don't we put this in, we're working on this thing we're calling the Super Famicom, aka Super Nintendo. This would be great in there. And so they're like, great, and they arranged a deal. Now, part of that 1988 deal was that Sony also said, hey, why don't we make like an add-on for this thing that your guys are doing? And then we'll have Sony, like one of the biggest technological conglomerates, working with Nintendo, the biggest name in gaming, again in 1988, working together. We could smash everybody. And so Nintendo was like, hell yeah! So they decided to come up with this deal together. Now you have to fast forward again to 1991 now, after the CDI is out. Now, Nintendo looks at the CDI and goes, wow, CDs are kind of a significant thing. Well, it's a good thing we're doing that thing with Sony, right? So they looked into more of the, I think they just suddenly decided, let's look more into the details of our deal, because by 91, the Super Famicom had already launched in Japan, and with, of course, the Sony sound chips in it, but it hadn't yet launched in North America or Europe. So what they were going to do was show off the device at the CES, Consumer Electronics Show of 91. And by reanalyzing their contract, they realized they had made a really stupid mistake in it. Essentially, they had agreed to give Sony everything regarding the add-on. Meaning, Sony would make all the money off of the hardware sales. They would make all the money off of music CD sales. They would make all the money off of educational titles. They would make all the money off of game titles. Now that was the big one. See, Nintendo had inadvertently agreed, we'll make a lot of games for this thing. We'll make all the Legend of Zeldas, all the Marios, we'll make all that for this add-on. Yet Nintendo would make nothing from it. Oops, big mistake. Because, of course, Nintendo, especially then, their entire business was predicated on this iron grip they had over everybody in gaming. And now suddenly they didn't even own really the rights to their own platform. Nintendo was understandably nervous. So what they decided to do was go to Sony and say like, hey guys, that deal we made 3 years ago, that was kind of a mistake. We still want to do it. We want to do everything we said, but there's one part of it, just this little thing we want to change. The game licensing thing. We need that back. And Sony basically said, hey asshole, you signed the paper, you know, this is the deal. So Nintendo was a little scared, frankly, and they decided to try to play hardball. They went to Philips and said, hey, would you guys like to make an add-on for the Super Nintendo? Would you like to take your CDI and you know, make it an attachment? Just do that. And but you know, if you do it, you got to give us game licensing rights. Like, we have to be able to do that. They basically made the deal with Philips they had meant to make with Sony. But Philips didn't really want to do this initially, because Philips was like, we already have a console, sort of. We don't really have much interest in competing with ourselves. And Nintendo was like, well, hang on. Here, we'll make a little bit of a deal with you. If you give us what we're asking for, we will license out to you our characters, meaning Mario, Zelda, presumably others like Metroid and so on. And you guys can make games with our characters officially. We won't make them, you guys can make them, we won't sue you, you guys can go ahead and make officially licensed games with our characters. And Philips, of course, jumped at this because, as I said, it was technically part of that list. If they could appeal to kids, they could have them bug their parents to put this thing in the home. So they said, all right, fine, we'll do it. Because even then, and as of course, even now, Zelda and Mario, they are huge franchises. So Philips ended up making that deal. So now, flash forward again to the CES show of that year in 1981. Sony goes up on stage and they debut what was actually called the PlayStation. It was 2 words. And it was just the add-on that would become part of the Super Nintendo. And they were like, we're working with Nintendo, awesome is that. And then they went over to Nintendo's booth, or Nintendo's big show, and this is where Nintendo was supposed to be like, that's right, Sony, we can't wait to work with you. Instead they went, we don't know what you're talking about. We're with Philips, and we're with them because they are the best at technology. Which was a huge slap in the face to Sony, because Sony was the immediate competitor of Philips. Now Nintendo was claiming officially that they didn't really think that 2 different add-ons would be that big of a deal. But really, the whole point was to piss off Sony and force them to give back the licensing thing, maybe claiming, hey, you know, we'll cut off our deal with Philips if you guys do what we said. And Sony didn't really comply with that. For the next year, they ended up deciding, you know what, fuck you, Nintendo. We're going to make our own platform, a standalone machine called the PlayStation. Again, not the one you're thinking of. but a standalone machine that was capable of playing Sony's new proprietary format as well as Super Nintendo cartridges. And this would have been all legitimate. Now they showed that off at the CES the next year in 1992. And at the same time, they decided, oh, by the way, Nintendo, you know, for working with Philips, our #1 competitor, the people we dislike the most, yeah, we're going to work with yours. Sony ended up making games for the Genesis and especially the Sega CD, which is like kind of mind-blowing when you really think about it. So this was a huge mess that all these companies were in, but they didn't care. They kept up with it. And eventually, third-party developers kind of went to Nintendo and was like, you can't keep doing this. You have this thing coming out for Philips's Philips add-on. Philips got its own console now. You have the Super Nintendo. You got some weird Super Nintendo add-on. Sony's got some sort of shit going on. Sega's got this going on. We can't have this many damn platforms. You have to figure this out. This is all your fault, basically. So Nintendo basically agreed to get into a room together with Sony and Philips and come up with a deal. And the deal was as follows. They agreed that Philips would be the ones making the new add-on platform. However, Sony would make all of the money off of the proprietary format, including all things related to music and movies, sales, etc. But the one thing Nintendo would get out of it is all the game software like they had always wanted. And of course, Philips would end up with the actual hardware sales. Thus, they proposed, I believe it was in 1993, the SNES CD. And in 1993, while they were working on this, Nintendo was stuck, obviously, in a heated battle with Sega over the Genesis, and especially at that point, the Sega CD, and the Sega CD being able to show off like what it could do, where the SNES actually wasn't capable of that because of the extra abilities the Sega CD had given the Genesis. So Nintendo needed independently to one-up their immediate competition, and they came out with the FX chip. Now, by doing so, they had immediately made the SNES CD almost irrelevant. Like, the SNES CD was no longer more impressive than the FX chip. This caused another delay until 1994, when finally they showed us what it was going to look like and what the specs were, etc. And they got really close until I think reality just started to sit in around, especially Nintendo, when they looked at the world and said, we've been working on this thing since 1988, and it has not come out, and now there are multiple CD platforms out there. 5th generation consoles, early ones, mind you, are already out the door, like the 3DO, the Jaguar, etc. They're already out there, and the SNES, as great as it is actually kind of on its way out. I don't know how much of a point there is in releasing this thing anymore. So they ended up calling off the whole deal with everybody. Now, what came of that, of course, was that the Nintendo 64 was born and used cartridges, probably partially due to Nintendo just being absolutely disgusted with everything they had just gone through with CDs. Sony, of course, went off and said, fuck it, we were going to make our own console and we're going to continue to. It'll be the PlayStation, which is what we actually do know. And then there was Philips. And of course, all they ended up getting out of this whole damn thing was that they were able to sell a couple of copies of Zelda, the Unholy Triforce Zelda games, and Hotel Mario. That's all that really came out of it for them. So I told you, Philips, despite that story being, like, it's insanity, all the thing that went around them, but they really didn't, the actual console had very little to do with it. But yet it's caught up in the whole thing. So now let's talk about some other aspects of this console itself. Now, the console actually isn't the disaster that people think it was as far as sales. It actually sold just over 1 million units worldwide. However, the vast majority of that was in Europe, where it's the only place where it actually saw any real kind of success. Like I said, I don't think it came out in Japan. It did come out here, but I have never seen one, ever. I have seen games for it, which I'll talk about in a bit, but the actual platform I have never seen. But I was in Europe just last year, and I saw it at multiple stores. It's just much more common over there. And also, there's a lot of different models. Like, this is just 2 of them. This is the Philips CDI 450, and this bigger one is the CDI 220. There are other builds that I do not have. There are also other builds by other companies. Philips kind of had a 3DO-like logic with this thing. They would allow other companies to make models and just license out the rights to it, I guess. Kind of like I said with 3DO. But like the only company I know that actually ended up supporting that or doing that was Magnavox. Ended up making a version of the CDI. There might be more, but I honestly don't know. Now let's take a look at the controllers. And the controllers get dogged all the time because people think they're supposed to be game controllers. Like, what? That's the worst game controller ever. Yeah, it would be if it was for a game. It's a remote control like for a movie device. Yes, it would work fine for point and clicks and educational games. Think about it. Yes, obviously you wouldn't want to play a traditional game on this. But they did actually release a traditional game controller, which obviously looks very similar to a Super Nintendo controller, does it not? This controller is actually extraordinarily rare. I'm actually very fortunate to have it. Again, thank you to Ronald for hooking me up with this thing. It's not a bad controller. I mean, if you've held a Super Nintendo controller, you've basically held a CDI controller. The only difference is that the rounding is not consistent. Like the Super Nintendo controller, the grips are on the bottom. This one has one on the top and one on the bottom, and has no triggers. Other than that, you know, it's fine. It's the same basic controller. No starter select though. But yeah, it was only useful for a handful of games, but yet it's still the most desired controller, again, for gaming. Now I want to talk about some of these games. I would talk about my experience with it. I mean, I guess I'll tell you what little I have. But the thing is, you guys have seen it. You saw it live. You know, I did an unboxing where I did it. You saw me get one for the first time ever. Really, the only thing that's happened to me since then is, you know, I played it and I wanted to get more games. So I went out to a store here in Chicago, hoping that they would have some. You know, a good retro game store called People Play Games. Fortunately for me, they did. They actually told me, like, well, you're in luck. You know, there was a woman in here 2 weeks ago. Her husband, I guess, worked for Philips, had like a massive collection. I think they said it was a complete set. And I guess he had died, unfortunately, and she decided to just sell all his stuff, and that's where she figured she could sell it. So they said we actually had to go through all this stuff and try it all out and everything. I was like, oh, that's great. What do you recommend? And they were like, well, Hotel Mario. And I was like, you actually recommend Hotel Mario? They're like, oh, no, it's a terrible game. And I was like, well, then why? They were like, because that's it. That's it. You know, like, we don't have the Zelda ones. The boss took those. He kept those for himself. But Hotel Mario is just about the only game with any, like, walking around and interactivity. Like, the closest thing to a platformer that exists on the console. When you think about it, that is really strange. To put that in perspective, platformers, at this point in time, when this console was out, were the first-person shooters of the day. Like, to not have that would be like a console coming out now and just saying, no first-person shooters ever. I guess in a sense that is the Wii U. But even the Wii U has some. You know, I mean, the CDI has no platformers, which is really strange. So now let's talk about some of the games I actually do have. And I got to apologize in advance. I've only played about half of these, and because the other half I got from Ronald very recently. I just haven't had a chance to try them out. And honestly, almost all of them are in German, so I can't even really read a description to you, but I'll try my best. Defender of the Crown. This looks to be a point-and-click adventure. Escape from Cyber City. It looks to be one of those games like Space Ace or Brain Dead 13, you know, those Don Bluth type of games, because it's got a lot of, looks like a cartoon-like video element to it. But yeah, there you go. It's supposed to be one of the better ones. Better. Inca looks odd. Again, it looks like another one game kind of like that. It's, you know, just an interactive movie, essentially. Now, Little Devil, this is interesting because the store I was talking about, this is one of the ones they recommended. Of course, they wanted like something like $40 for it, and I was like, eh. Because it is fundamentally an FMV game, I guess with some other elements that make it less shitty than most FMV games. But what's worthy of noting is that it actually mentions right on here that you require the digital video cartridge. Now, I'm going to sidetrack from the games for a second to talk about this. The digital video cartridge is an add-on, sort of. It depends on how you define an add-on. Personally, I would include it because it's a piece of equipment you could, you know, attach to the console later to give it new features it didn't previously have. Much like, I guess you could debate the same thing was the 32X, you know, etc. So, like, it even says it right on the back of this one, extension slot for digital video cartridge. Like, it has things that you can like remove and add this expansion. Now, in the case of these consoles, this one does not have that. This one does. So this game would work here, it would not work here. But yeah, it's just, it technically had an add-on and this game required it. That's all. the Palm Springs Open, which is golf. Funny enough, this one's in German, of course, and it says Die Palm Springs Open. It just means the, but in English, that's pretty funny. Die Palm Springs. Yeah, I know. Terrible joke. But yeah, just a golf game. Pinball. Surf City, which, as I recall, I did play this one. It was a while ago. I didn't play for very long. I think it was like a paint type of game, with like clearly for like little kids. It even says it right on the back for ages 7 and up. Treasures of the Smithsonian, obviously one of those like type of educational games where parents would hope that, you know, little Billy would learn something by, you know, if you bought him this game in particular. Video Speedway Racing. This one was one of the better ones and still not very good because it's mostly FMV sequences of races and you're kind of trying to control it, but that doesn't really work because it's essentially a QTE game. And I'm just noticing now that I put a couple of them off to the side by accident. The same game, actually. I have 2 copies of Tetris. Now, Ronald sent me this copy later. I didn't know he was going to do that, or I wouldn't have bought this. This is the only game I bought at that store that I was talking about. Now, obviously it's different. I guess this is the packaging that a lot of the American games came in. Not all, of course. We did get a lot of the jewel case style. But, you know, just thought that was interesting to note since I can actually show you that. I like this packaging because it makes me feel like it's judging me. It looks too professional for a video game. I don't know how else to put that. It looks like something, I don't know, I feel like I need to go to the opera or something for this to be worthy of me. I don't know, maybe you feel like the same. This is just, to me it's just weird. But yeah, the game is Tetris. It's actually supposed to be one of the best games on the console. Of course, Tetris is a classic game. And this is actually a pretty good version of it. And it used a lot of full motion video backgrounds to, I guess, make you feel like your Tetris experience was more civilized. You know, you're in the forest and you have waterfalls, you know, other shit like that. It's just Tetris, we're playing Tetris today. Like, that's just how it comes off. But yeah, I've got that. Now, of course, as mentioned, Hotel Mario, which I'm glad I've got, even though it's a bad game, yes, but it is actually, honestly, it probably is one of the best games on the console. Tetris was good, you know, if you like Tetris. I mean, it's slim pickings, let's be honest, with the CDI. The game library is pretty slim, so it's good to have Hotel Mario. Now, there were actually, we only learned about this really recently. There were 3 Mario games in development for the CDI. This was the only one that was ever officially released. Now, there was also Mario's Wacky Worlds, which was never released, but it was leaked onto the internet. Supposedly, that's like a spiritual successor to Super Mario World. I have not tried that one yet. Fortunately, the CDI is capable of playing burned games, so you could actually download it, burn it, and try it, and I probably will do that in all honesty, because I'm very curious. I just haven't done it yet. But what we just learned was there was a 3rd one. Now, the details on this, you'd have to look it up to get like the full story. I'm just going to give you the highlights. Apparently what happened is that the 3rd game was being developed in Canada, and the company developing it, I think they got pretty far, if not nearly completed with that game, and but they were unable to pay some sort of bill or whatever, and so the Canadian government actually seized the assets of the game. And to this day, apparently all the builds and everything for it, which apparently was functional, is sitting in some sort of vault somewhere in Ottawa, capital of Canada. This apparently was recently a discovered piece of information. A lot of the developers, I guess, were talking about it in an interview. So look that up. It's a pretty interesting story. Hopefully one day somebody theoretically could just pay that bill and then the game could be leaked. I doubt that'll ever happen. Who would care enough? But if it does happen, one day we might be able to enjoy that game. Hopefully the Canadian government will see this and have a heart and let us all enjoy something new on the CDI. I doubt it'll happen. And then, of course, there was the infamous Zelda Unholy Triforce, meaning there were 3 different Zelda games for the CDI. 2 of them are, I'm not going to say they're common, but they're a little bit more common. I don't have those. I would like to get them, certainly. They're like a brother and sister type of game. You know, they take place at the same time. They were made at the same time. They're very similar. It's the one I'm sure more of you are familiar with the weird, funky cartoons in it that just are obviously terrifying to most people. They're awful games. I mean, you could watch the AVGN's review of those. He does complete justice to them. But there is a 3rd one, which he also talked about, by the way. And that game is extraordinarily rare. Usually sells upwards to like $500, usually on the low end is like $350, usually sitting around the $400 range. I got it. Fortunately for me, I didn't pay anywhere near those numbers. I'm not going to go into the whole story of how I got this here. I might talk about it on the next playload. There's no reason to bog down this video. But the point is, Zelda's Adventure, I got this for way less money than most people get it for. And I'm happy to have it, even though I know the game sucks. It's considered the best of the three, but it is still not a particularly good game. It's definitely just a collector's piece. That is really all it is. But the funny thing is, even to Super Zelda fans, this isn't that interesting because Nintendo didn't even include these games in the official timeline, which says a lot. So there you go.
Ironically, because these games ended up being so bad, all they really served as was advertisements for the Super Nintendo. Do you like Mario? Do you like Zelda? Well, they have much better games on a superior platform.
It's a very misunderstood platform, but it's not a good game console. I can't honestly say I would actually recommend getting one unless you're a collector. Like, I love it. No one's taking it away from me. I'm glad I've got it. But it really is just a novelty and an interesting kind of footnote in history. But it did last a lot longer than people think. I mean, it wasn't discontinued until 1998. I would have assumed it was discontinued in like 92 or 93 based on the way people talk about it. But no, it actually lasted a while. It outlasted the Saturn, at least in North America, which is very odd. But yeah, so... oh, and one other note I do want to give you, if you actually are interested in picking one of these up, especially if you're in North America, get this one. I know it's bigger, and that obviously will be a pain in the ass when it comes to shipping, and this one is actually a better looking model in my opinion, and it's smaller, and it's more associated with the CDI in general. This one is more easily modified for RGB, meaning you won't, if you use it correctly, you won't run into like the 50 Hz, 60 Hz issue, so you can actually... Point is, you could actually use this device in North America and import it from Europe, whereas this one, that's not really possible. Ronald modified this one. He said this one, quite simply, that couldn't be done with. So this one is, I literally can't use this unless I hook it up to like a PAL to NTSC device, which is pointless because this one outputs RGB and plays all the same shit. So why not just use this one? So that's a little piece of advice to you guys. This console's huge though. Look at this. This is the biggest video game console I have, and apparently there are versions of the CDI that are even bigger than this one. Right? Well, whatever. And you're going to see a pretty big console soon. So stay tuned to part 9, which will be the final part of this series. It will be on the Pioneer Laser Active. Yes, we're actually including that. I know, we're including it. You'll see. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you all later.